I want you to hold two images in your mind. In the first, Nicolas Maduro is standing in Caracas, smiling, calling Xi Jinping an older brother, as Chinese diplomats calmly review hundreds of long-term agreements. In the second, taken just hours later, that same man is blindfolded, handcuffed, photographed on the deck of a US warship. That contrast is not dramatic by accident. It is the story. What happened in Venezuela was not simply a raid. It was a shockwave, one that tore through a global system China has spent decades patiently learning how to work within. Beijing does not fear Venezuela itself. It fears what comes when rules dissolve and power starts moving without warning. Donald Trump has injected something China despises into the international order: strategic chaos. If you want to understand why Beijing is suddenly uneasy, why this moment matters far beyond Caracas, stay with me, because this is not really about Maduro at all. To see the real stakes, we first need to step back and define the problem Trump has just created. What makes this moment so destabilizing is not the scale of the operation, but the signal it sends. For years, China believed it understood the rules of the game: invest quietly, build influence patiently, avoid direct confrontation. In Venezuela, that strategy worked. Beijing gained oil, leverage, and a loyal partner without firing a shot. Then, in a matter of hours, that assumption collapsed. Trump's move was a declaration that influence alone is no longer protection, that long-term agreements, infrastructure loans, and diplomatic loyalty can be swept aside if Washington decides the costs are worth it. For China, this raises an uncomfortable question. If the United States is willing to act this way in Venezuela, where exactly are the limits? This is why Beijing's reaction has been so careful. Publicly, it condemns the raid as a violation of sovereignty. Privately, it reassesses risk, political, financial, and strategic across the entire global South. Because Venezuela is not an isolated case. It is a test. And to understand why this test is so dangerous for China, we need to look at how this relationship was built in the first place. The relationship between Beijing and Caracas did not emerge overnight. It was built slowly, methodically, almost mechanically. At the turn of the century, Venezuela had what China needed most: oil. And China had what Venezuela lacked most: cash, infrastructure financing, and a partner that did not lecture it about governance or human rights. It was a clean transaction. Railways, power plants, and development projects flowed in one direction, crude oil flowed in the other. For more than 2 decades, this arrangement suited both sides. China secured long-term energy supplies to fuel its rising economy. Venezuela gained a financial lifeline as Western investment dried up. Politics stayed in the background. Stability was assumed. But there was a hidden fragility in this model. China's influence in Venezuela was built on contracts, loans, and continuity, not control. It worked only as long as the international environment remained predictable and as long as power respected the appearance of rules. That assumption is now gone. And when stability is replaced by sudden force, long-built relationships can unravel in a single night. The first rupture came suddenly, and it was meant to shock. A nighttime raid, a sitting president seized, images released with surgical precision. Maduro was no longer a negotiating partner or a political problem. He was a detainee. And with that single act, Washington transformed Venezuela from a slow-burning crisis into a live geopolitical flashpoint. For China, this was the moment when abstraction turned into risk. Beijing had always calculated that its investments were protected by scale and patience. More than $100 billion in financing, decades of cooperation, hundreds of agreements. Surely that counted for something. But Trump's move suggested otherwise. It said that economic entanglement is not a shield when strategic priorities shift. The message was unmistakable. Influence can be overridden by force. This is why Beijing's public condemnation sounded restrained, almost legalistic, words about sovereignty, warnings about international law. Beneath that calm language was a realization that Chinese assets, oil fields, infrastructure projects, outstanding loans were now exposed to forces it does not control. If this can happen in Venezuela, it can happen anywhere. Influence collides with power. And that leads us to the deeper question China now has to confront. What exactly changed in the system itself? What changed was not just an action, but a logic. For years, China operated on a simple assumption. The international system rewarded patience. If you invested early, stayed quiet, and avoided confrontation, your position would eventually become too embedded to disrupt. Venezuela fit that model perfectly. Chinese money filled gaps the West left behind. Chinese companies became indispensable. Over time, influence hardened into permanence. Trump shattered that belief. His move revealed a different mechanism at work, one where dominance, not integration, sets the boundaries. In this system, long-term contracts matter less than immediate leverage. Stability is not preserved, it is imposed. And rules are not frameworks to operate within, but tools to be invoked or ignored depending on the moment. This is deeply uncomfortable for Beijing. China's rise has been built inside the existing order, not outside it. It learned how to use institutions, norms, and economic interdependence as shields. When those shields fail, China is forced into terrain it prefers to avoid: uncertainty, rapid escalation, and zero-sum calculations. Venezuela exposed that vulnerability. And once that mechanism is visible, it does not stay confined to one country. It creates a second, sharper crisis, one that China has been quietly trying not to name. The second crisis is not unfolding in Caracas. It is unfolding in Beijing's calculations. Trump's raid forced Chinese leaders to confront a question they had long postponed. What happens when American power stops signaling and starts acting? The answer is deeply unsettling, because Venezuela was never central to China's economy. It was peripheral. And yet, Washington still intervened decisively. That changes the risk map overnight. Suddenly, Chinese planners have to ask whether influence itself has become a liability, whether deep investments now attract attention rather than protection, whether being visible, successful, embedded, indispensable actually makes you a target when strategic lines are drawn. This is why the reaction in Beijing has been cautious, almost frozen. China does not rush into crises. It studies them, it waits, it tests reactions. But waiting is itself a form of vulnerability when the other side thrives on unpredictability. The concern is not that the United States will repeat this move everywhere. It is that no one can be sure where it will stop. And when uncertainty replaces expectation, long-term strategies begin to crack. Investors hesitate, partners grow nervous. Influence that once felt permanent starts to look provisional. That is the second crisis Trump triggered. And its consequences are felt not in palaces or ministries, but in the daily lives of ordinary people. And this is where the story finally reaches you. Because when great powers gamble, it is never their own citizens who feel the first shock. It is ordinary people living inside systems they did not design and cannot escape. If you are a Venezuelan worker, chaos means inflation that erodes your savings overnight, jobs that vanish without warning, a future that becomes harder to plan with each passing week. If you are part of the Chinese business community operating abroad, it means projects frozen, contracts questioned, and years of effort suddenly placed at risk by decisions made oceans away. And even if you live far from Caracas or Beijing, you are not insulated. When stability breaks, prices move, energy markets tighten, supply chains wobble. The cost of uncertainty quietly makes its way into your life. This is why moments like this matter. Not because they are dramatic, but because they rewrite the background conditions of everyday life. If you want to make sense of the world you are moving through, why it feels less predictable, more tense, this is part of the answer. Power is becoming more visible, more abrupt, less restrained, and that shift does not stop at national borders. It ripples outward, reshaping the global system itself. That ripple is now moving beyond any single country. When the United States acts this way in Venezuela, other governments take note, not just in Latin America, but across the global south. The message they hear is not subtle. Deep ties with China may no longer be a neutral economic choice. They may carry strategic consequences. For Beijing, this is the real danger. Its influence in the developing world rests on a promise of stability. No lectures, no sudden pressure, long-term partnership. But Trump's move threatens to puncture that narrative. If hosting Chinese investment risks attracting American intervention, some governments will hesitate, not because they distrust China, but because they fear Washington. This is already visible in the background. Concerns about ports, infrastructure, energy projects, questions about whether strategic assets could become liabilities, and when doubt enters, momentum slows. The competition between the US and China was once largely economic and diplomatic. Venezuela suggests it is becoming something else, more explicit, more territorial, more zero-sum. And when great power rivalry sharpens like this, it forces every other country to reassess where it stands and how much risk it is willing to carry. Which brings us to the hardest question of all: what happens next? Looking ahead, there are three paths this story could take. The first is the optimistic one. Chaos stabilizes. Venezuela settles into a new equilibrium. China absorbs its losses, adjusts quietly, and continues building influence elsewhere. Trump's raid becomes an exception, not a model. The second is more likely. Uncertainty lingers. China stays engaged, but more cautious. Investments slow. Risk premiums rise. The global south becomes a chessboard where every major decision is weighed against potential American reaction. Influence continues, but at a higher cost. The third is the darkest. Precedent hardens. Force replaces patience as the defining language of power. The logic seen in Venezuela spreads to energy routes, infrastructure hubs, strategic choke points. China responds not with chaos, but with counter-pressure, and the world slips further into a system where stability is no longer assumed, only enforced. Which path emerges depends less on ideology than on restraint, on whether power remembers its limits. And that brings us to the final insight this moment reveals. What Trump's Venezuela raid ultimately exposes is not Chinese weakness or American strength. It exposes a world in transition. For decades, the international system rewarded those who played the long game. China mastered that approach. But when rules become optional and force becomes decisive, even the most patient strategies are put at risk. Beijing understands this. That is why it is uneasy, not because it lost Venezuela, but because it glimpsed a future it does not control. For you, the takeaway is simple but unsettling. The world is becoming less predictable, not more. Power is louder, moves are faster, and the margin for error is shrinking. If you want to understand the next decade, where conflicts emerge, where markets tremble, where alliances shift, watch moments like this. Not the speeches, but the actions. Because when the rules break in one place, they rarely stay broken there alone. And in the world now taking shape, everyone is exposed to the consequences.